Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Freezed. Freezed is a really awesome package. I'd say I use it on pretty much every Flutter project I have done in the last couple of years, unless I'm using ServerPod because it sort of already has its own implementation of what this solves. So Freezed is made by our good friend Remy, and we can look at some of the things he's created, Provider probably being one of the most famous and popular, as well as Riverpod, which if you've watched my channel before, you know I'm a fan. I have touched on Freezed in quite a few of my videos, but it's usually just kind of part of a bigger picture. Today I really want to dig in and show you why you should be using it and what's so great about it and how to get the most use of it. If we look at it right here, we have Freeze 2.5.7, and the actual docs just on this landing page of the pub.dev is very, very thorough. And there's a lot here. And frankly, to build at least most applications, you only need a fraction of this. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on is the stuff I use all the time. Really a lot to do with serialization and deserialization and all the helpers you get that go a long way. So let's get into it. So I want to explain one thing. For purposes of this tutorial, I am actually just doing this in pure Dart. This is not a Flutter application, it's a Dart application. And I think it's just an easier way to sort of demo this stuff in kind of like a sandboxy way. But every single thing I'm showing you will work the same way in Flutter. There's no difference at all. The only difference we're going to see is how we install the packages in a moment here. So what really is Freezed? So it's a way to essentially have models in your application and work with them in a really nice way, especially with serialization and deserialization. So for instance, I'm calling an API and I'm getting data back. I want to be able to handle that and convert it to a type-safe Dart object rather than working with it as, a map string dynamic. That's really, what it's meant for, but it comes with a lot of other helpers, as well as a very well put together copyWith. I'm sure you've seen and probably written your own copyWith examples, and it's pretty easy to do, but it gets tedious, unless you're using some kind of code generator or whatnot. But another thing about the copyWith, at least the basic way in the sort of JSON in the ways you'll usually do it, is in copyWith, if you want to change, if you want to like re-null something, so say you have a field that has a value but it's nullable, and now you want to make a copy of it and make that value null, it's actually not that straightforward to do because when you pass null in, you end up actually it gets ignored because that's kind of how the default copyWith works. The built-in one in Freeze is amazing and just works the way you would expect it. It does use code generators, and I know that Remy has been working on, and there's a beta version of it or something, at least an experimental version using the new Dart macros, but of course that's not stable at the time of this recording. So you do have to have the generators, at least for now, but it's at the top of his list to, as soon as it's stable, macros and stuff, we'll be able to use this without generators, and that's pretty awesome. So yeah, what I've set up is just a very basic Dart CLI application, just by doing, Dart create project name, very similar to making a Flutter project. The difference is we don't have any of the Flutter dependencies. We don't have that example material app. And what I've done is I've made a mock backend. So normally your backend would probably live in a different code base, maybe a different language, or it could be like something on Supabase or Firebase or all these kinds of things. But what I'm doing is I'm just kind of making one in here because this isn't about, networking per se. This is just about serializing, deserializing. And you'll see we're going to be using cars as this example. We have two different cars in here, and this is just a map string dynamic, sort of thing. And we have an API endpoint, more or less, to get the cars and one to get a car. And really it just either sends this back or just the first one is where we have right now. So just something to work off of. So think of that as this wouldn't in the real world live within our code base, at least our front end code base. But for my purposes, it's just the easiest way to demo this. And then I've also built a car service, and this is just the stub of it. There's no functionality yet, but the idea is we're going to pass in that backend as sort of like a dependency and then work with it. So that's, kind of the idea. So let's get to it. First thing we're going to want to do is install some packages. So like I said, this does change depending on if you're using Flutter or if you're using Dart. And if we go to the documentation here, you'll see for a Flutter project, we're going to do this. For a Dart project, we're going to do this. Exact same thing. The only difference is the word Flutter. The word Flutter is kind of like the way you install it, right? Flutter instead of Dart. And we are going to be using the generators, we always use generators in Freeze, but we are going to be using the JSON annotation. So we're going to want these as well. So if you're following along in Flutter, just follow these instructions. If you're following along in Dart, we'll follow these. So I'm just going to grab these. I have a terminal window open here, and I'm just going to put these all in, but I'm going to get rid of that one line that, maybe I should have done this before. We're going to get rid of this one line here because that's just a little comment, and I don't know how our terminal will handle that. And we'll just hit enter, and we'll get all these lovely things installed. So now if we look at our pub spec, we should see that we have build runner. So build runner is a tool not specific to Freeze, but allows us to sort of run things like code generation. We have Freezed itself. It is a dev dependency, which is kind of nice. So it's just really for our development side. We have JSON serializable, which is also a dev dependency. And then lints and tests were already here. And then we have our freezed annotation and JSON annotation, which we need in order to actually, freeze annotation we need no matter what. JSON annotation we need if we're doing serialization, which we will be in this video. Okay, so we have some stuff installed. Very good. Now what I'm going to do is I have a folder called models, nothing in it yet, but we're going to actually make our first model, car.dart. All right. So our car.dart is going to make use of freeze. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually import in the freezed annotation right here. And we're going to create a class. And we're going to make this a sealed class. This is not a requirement, but it is a good practice to do in Dart 3 in general when it's a class you do not want to be able to be extended. And we don't need that feature. We don't need to make this extendable right now. So we're going to make it a sealed class. And we're going to call it car, and we're going to add the mixin _ money sign car. You'll see this isn't found, but it will when we run our code generator. This will be a class that gets auto-generated and gives all the functionality that we could ever want. Next, what we're going to want to do is create a factory of that car. And within here is where we put sort of like all of our parameters. And if we look at our backend, we can kind of get an idea of what we're going to have here. We're going to have a name, which seems to be a string. We're going to have a color. We're going to have a year. We're going to have a whole bunch of other stuff. For explaining this better, I am going to start with just the first two, and we're going to work with that and walk through everything. And then we're going to go through and add the other types of things because they all have a slightly, there's a reason I put them in this order and a reason I want to use them and explain. So we're going to start by making a required string called name. We're also going to have required int for year. We're going to do that one next. Just call that year. Then what we need to do is make this equal to something. So it's going to actually be equal to _car, just like that. And you'll notice right here, this is different. This is $$car, and this is _car. So it's a little bit, in fact, I've used Freeze so much, I don't have this memorized. I'm looking, at the sort of reference that I built ahead of this. So don't feel like, oh, I have to remember all these things. Like, it's very easy just to look up in the documentation how to do this. The last thing we're going to want to make, and this is because we want to work with this API and essentially take map string dynamic data and turn it into this car, is we're going to create our factory for a fromJson. And similarly, this also uses a generated class that's going to happen called car fromJson. And what we're going to be passing in is just map string dynamic, and it will essentially generate a car behind the scenes for us. All right, and that's good enough for sort of our starting spot here. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to actually decorate this as a freezed object. So we're just using this annotation @freezed, all lowercase. And because it's going to create files, we need to make this part. We need to have some other files that are going to be part of this file. So we can use the part keyword. And first we need to have car.freeze.dart. And this will be all the code to do with essentially this part here, anything to do with the model. And then we're also going to have a part of car.g.dart. And this is actually the generated code to do anything to do with fromJson. So we're going to save that. And in our terminal, we now need to run our build runner command. So you might be familiar with this. I'm sure maybe you're familiar with this. I'm going to do it down here because it's a little bit of a longer line. And what we want to run is dart pub run. And then we're going to run the package build runner. And we specifically want to run the command build, which will actually build our code. And then we can do -- delete conflicting outputs. And this is just like a helper safety kind of thing when anytime there's any kind of issues because you have maybe like an old version of your model and a new version, this will just delete anything that is conflicting and kind of do it as, from scratch. So that's what we're going to run. And this will go and it will run this, and it shouldn't take that long because we just have one model. As your project grows, these things do take longer, and that's partly why I'm very excited for macros, because this stuff just happens at the interpreter level or compile level, or it's something more complicated than I even completely understand, but it's amazing and when I've played with it. All right, so now we have this cool class called car. And there's no more errors anymore, and we can actually command click through these things or control click on Windows, and we can see all this generated code. Do not modify by hand. You can modify this by hand, but as soon as you run your build runner again, it will be wiped and built again from your definitions here. So this is all the code we needed, and this was the code that was generated specifically for the freezed aspect of this, which has various things like there's a whole bunch of cool stuff in here. Look at all of it. We're not going to go through it. You can look at it if you want, if you're trying at home, but it's a lot of powerful code. And if we look at this one right here, we'll see. Sorry, let me actually go over here. You're going to see these two files. So we have the freezed one. That's the one we looked at. There's also the car.g.json, and this is actually the implementation for the fromJson and toJson, which we will need. So those are the two files made. If you run the generator, nothing happens. Couple things that you might have missed. Putting the freeze annotation, that's a common mistake. Not including these will cause this not to work. And lastly, you definitely need to make sure the file name here, like basically car.dart, is the same as this. And you're just kind of putting in the middle either both freezed and G. If you miss the G, this is not going to work here. If you miss the freeze, nothing will work. Okay, so now we have our lovely car model. Let's play around with it. So we're going to go to our car service, and we're going to make a function to essentially go and talk to our fake backend, our mock backend here. So let's make something, it's going to return a future list, and in this case we're going to return a car, a list of cars, and of course this is the model that we made right here. Very nice. And we'll just call this list cars, very creatively, and it is going to be asynchronous. And what we want to do here is get we're going to have a final list dynamic of, we'll just call it results. And what we need to do is use our await, and we're going to await our backend dot get cars. Okay, so that right there is just calling this function. And just for review, all this is doing is returning all these cars, but it's actually putting a future dot delayed here just to kind of simulate a network call. Again, this is just for explanation purposes. Okay. Now what we want to do is, because we're getting multiple cars back, we need to essentially take this, which is just a list dynamic, because usually when you're working with an API, the data coming back is pretty dynamic. So we kind of have to stub it that way, and then we want to actually convert it to something. So to do this, we're going to take our results and we're going to map through them. Okay, and for each result, what we actually want to do is take our car and run the factory from JSON by passing in this right here. And this is our dynamic data. Very good. And then at the very end, we need to convert this to a list because it's just an iterable without putting to list. And we want to conform to this. So there we have this way to do this. And if we, of course, go to our main.dart right here, I've already kind of stubbed this stuff in to save some time, but we can do, let's just do final cars equals service dot list cars. And we do want to await this because it is an asynchronous call. So then this will be a list of cars. And let's actually, print those cars out. And to run this, we just need to go, in this case, dart bin main.dart. And this will run and give us these sort of cars back here, which there we have. We have our car with a name Corvette, year 1970. and this right here. And maybe if you worked with models before, you're used to it just kind of saying instance of car or something like that. I haven't done it in a while because I usually work with freeze. Freeze has its own built-in toString automatically that kind of like makes it look like what the model would look like. So it's just better for debugging and that kind of stuff if you are printing something out. All right, what I want to do now is take just a little bit of a little more debugging here. I have this little thing I'm going to paste in here that is essentially going to debug print a car. So what we're going to see is when we run this function, it's just going to actually print the car itself. But we're also going to then run a JSON encode on the car.toJSON to see what the car looks like if we were then sending it back up to our API to maybe save it, patch it, that kind of thing. So instead of just printing cars, I'm going to use this. But we will need to put this in a loop, so we can just do final car of cars. Car in cars. That was a JavaScript thought in my head. There we go. And we can print it this way. So let's run that again. And in fact, for this, I think maybe running it down here might be more visible. So we'll just run dart bin main.dart. And right here we see, okay, the first car is printing it out. This is just the toString like we saw before, but then the toJSON, we actually see it in this sort of JSON. And notice that we do have it as a string here, but there's no quotes around this because it's being turned back into a number before being sent up instead of a string. So just small little things, and we'll see it in even greater fashion as we kind of go through and add the other fields. Because remember, right now, all we're worrying about is the name and the year, but we're going to go through and add a whole bunch of things. So let's add a few more fields. We'll go back to our car model, and we're going to add the field for whether or not it's a convertible. So this will be a bool, and we will do convertible. Again, this is just corresponding with our mock backend. We have convertible somewhere in here as a Boolean, true/false. So we're going to do that, and that's pretty straightforward. So let's do one more that has a little bit of more complexity. So something that's in our backend is the idea of an owner. So we see owner, it's just a string in this case. It could be a full other nested object, but in our example, it's just a string. However, it could also be null, you'll see here based on the data right there. So what we do for this, it's no longer going to be a required field. We'll make it a optional string and just call it owner. And that's all we have to do to support that. So now we can run this again, our build runner that is. And what I'll do instead of running build this time, we'll just change it to watch. And what this will do, we keep this running, and as code changes happen and we save essentially any of our files that have this generation annotation, it'll run it. And this is a really good practice, especially in a bigger project, because the first time it'll still take the same amount of time as doing a build, but now it only is going to know to build the files when that one changes. So for instance, if I made this owner1 or something and save, we'll actually see it's quite fast. It's not going through and reading our whole project. It's just doing it for this file. So it's a nice thing to do to keep things quick. Let me make sure that we spelt convertible right by copying it over, because that would be a silly error. It looks like it's right. There we go. So just to kind of see this, let us run that function again. And we can, let's see, I'm going to just keep this running in the background and make a fully new tab just to have the room. And let's just run our main.dart again. And now we'll see a bit more data here. We'll see on the first one, we have owner Tyler. Notice this is just the Dart interpretation of it. So we're not seeing quotes and stuff like that because it's just how the toString works, which is technically something we can override in freezed if you wanted to. But in the when we actually see the toJSON, it is a string, just as we'd expect. And it's null in this case, and it's null. Not null in quotes, just null, just like you would think it would be when working with a JSON-based API. Next, let's add another challenge into the mix here. So let's do wheels. Okay, so we have this field called wheels here, which is an integer field. and it's 4, that would kind of make sense. But you'll notice in my second example, we don't even have a field there. And if we were to just work with this expecting it, like if I did something like required int wheels, just like that, and we'll save this. If we run this again, we're actually going to get a major error here because it did not find this num, it found a null. So that's kind of a problem, but I happen to know, and I think most people do, that at least, quite a few cars out there have generally 4 wheels. So we could decide to add a default here. So we can go default 4, just like that. And in this case, because we're setting a default, we don't actually need a required field because it doesn't have to be required in our response. And now, if we run it, we'll see we actually get stuff back. And you'll see wheels are 4 in both examples because we have this default. Pretty basic, but an important thing to know how to do. All right, the next one I want to show is this one, number of miles. And you'll see, and this is pretty typical with certain APIs, especially if one's built in, for instance, Python, so Fast API, Django, any of that kind of stuff. It is using snake case. So, but in Dart, we use something called camel case for our variable names. So we could decide, oh, well, the backend, they know what's right. So we could have just a required, this is an int in this case, number of miles. I could decide to do this, and this will work. If I actually run this, we will actually see the number of miles working correctly. But I have this warning here. It's saying something like, this isn't a lowercase camel case identifier. This is, if I was in a Python project, I'd be like, great name, great name. But in Dart, I'd be like, get out of here. That is not how we do it. So we'll change it to just number of miles like this. Let our generator run and rerun it. And we will see an error again because it's looking for a key with the name number of miles. How can we fix that? Well, let's enter our friend called JsonKey. This is a very powerful configuration that we can do for each field. And one of the options is, what is this thing actually called? So let's actually call it number of miles, like that. And we will just clear this and run it again. And now we'll actually see, okay, it worked. We have 10,000 miles and 15 or 150,000 miles or something like that. But you'll see in the Dart version, it's just like this, the number of miles, that's the toString. And that's what we're calling it in code, as we should be, so we don't get that warning. But when we do a toJSON on it, meaning when we're going to send it back to the server to maybe save it or something, it is converting it back. So this name field is like a two-way binding. It's for when we're doing the fromJSON and also the toJSON. So that's kind of nice and helpful. Now we will see this warning here. The annotation JsonKey can only be used on fields. We can fix this, and this is in the docs. This isn't just like a hack that I found. But if we go to our analysis options, we can actually put something in here and go to the docs to grab this, or I'll try and say it out. But basically, we can customize our analyzer to turn off the invalid annotation target. Frankly, I'm not 100% sure the reason for this, but I'm sure if you read deeper into the freeze documentation, you would see why. But doing this, gets rid of that pesky little underline right here, and I feel better about life. All right, so we now have number of miles. That's exciting. What are we going to do next? Okay, there's this thing called transmission, so that's nice. If we look at it here, we have transmission, manual being one option. Actually, let's make this one automatic. We might as well make them different. That makes sense, automatic, and one is manual. So we could, of course, follow the same kind of thing. Let me just close a couple things here. And we could just make this by simply saying required string transmission, and let everything run and run this, and everything worked great. We have automatic, here, and we have our, manual here. But, sometimes it's nice, especially when you have a few different options of something. And in this case, in a car, it's either, going to be automatic or a manual transmission, or maybe in our full app, there's also an unknown because maybe the listing for the car it doesn't know for some reason. Here, I'd like to make a enum to represent these two different, or, unknown as a third different option, so that in code, we're not worrying about using a string, like checking is manual. A typo is easy to happen when you just have strings and comparisons. In my my advice in a project, you never want to have the same string ever twice, because you just set up a pattern for making those kinds of mistakes. When you're seeing like those, that's where constants come in, that's where enums can come in, and we can easily make an enum. We'll call it transmission. You call it transmission, transmission type, whatever you want. And of course we can have manual and we can have automatic. Now, something I also like to do in enums and Dart 3, this was somewhere along the lines of Dart 3, this was a new feature. We can actually kind of create, make an enum a little more powerful and have a little more configuration on it. And I do like to do this. So what we can actually have is a string called value. And the value would be, okay, what is it called on the service side, in our API data. And then let's also have another one called label, because maybe if we're ever printing this out to the user, we don't want to use the lowercase version, or it's possible with your API, like it could just be like a 1 and a 2 representing these things. We want like a nice label. So we can put these, and then we can actually have a const constructor where we pass in this dot value and this dot name, or sorry, label. And now when we're actually defining these right here, we actually just put them in like this. So in this case, I'll do manual and manual. And similar with this, we will just take our automatic and automatic. Just paste that and make it a capital. So that's how we might want to do it. And then, yeah, maybe we have a third one that's just called unknown. And we can still, have something like unknown here, and also give it a label unknown. And this just keeps us flexible, because now if the API, your backend dev on your team is like, oh, I had to change it to like, manual 1 or exclamation mark or something, we can just make this change here and everything will work, and we don't have to go through and change our code. We can still call it this throughout everywhere. Same with the label. Maybe we're now calling this stick shift in our app. We can just change it here and we don't have to worry about any code changes. So that's why I like to do this. Now, what we can do is now convert this to, instead of a type string, we can use our own models or enums here as well. And in fact, just speaking to that, we can have other freeze models be a value here. And as long as the data coming back has that nested version of your sub model, it can go on for days. You can have a sub, and freeze just works. You don't have to do something fancy like, convert it to something. So let's just do that and save, and let's see what happens here. Interesting. I wasn't expecting this to work. Did my generator not run? It seemed to. Okay. But if we look at this, we actually have transmission.automatic and, oh. Wow. Okay. Sorry. This is something I didn't know before. It looks like freeze automatically actually handles this for me. Because just the names of everything I guess worked out, it was able to find this. That is something I didn't know. I was hoping to show like, oh, something went wrong. So let's actually call this like stick shift or something, just so that we can kind of see this example. In our code, we'll call it stick shift, and automatic, that's fine. We should get an error now, I imagine. Yeah, we're going to see this sort of error there. So my apologies. So yeah, if you use the exact same names here, I guess freeze is smart enough to figure it out. But we're going to use error because it's saying that manual is not one of the supported options. It's just stick shift, automatic, and unknown. So how can we handle that? So another thing we can do with our JsonKey is we can make it. We can actually create a toJson and a fromJson function. So we'll do that and toJson. Now, to make these functions, they can't be a function that like just lives in another file. You could have the logic in another file, but you do need to get it in here. It has to be a top-level, basically accessible function within the same file that you're in. As far as I know, at least unless something in freeze has changed since I've done it this way. But what we want to do is actually make a transmission to JSON. And what this will take is when we're converting to JSON, actually, sorry, let's start with from JSON. That's kind of our normal use case. Transmission from JSON. So we'd be getting a string back from the server. So we'll just call it string value. And what we want to return from this is actually a transmission. So we're just making this simple like mapper essentially. And there's various ways we could do this. We could have an if statement, if it equals manual, do this. If it equals automatic, do that. And that's kind of what I'm going to do. But instead, I am going to just actually use a switch statement. And we'll change this to stick shift as we have here. So we just have this simple way to convert it, and I'm going to show you in a bit a even faster way of doing it, or less tedious way, because this would get annoying if you had 100 different options here. And then what I'm going to do is make another option here, is the transmission from to JSON. and change this here from my example. And in this case, we're passing in, the actual R version of a transmission, and it should be returning a string. However, it's a nullable string because if it's unknown, that's how I'm imagining our API works. When it doesn't know, it's going to be null. And yeah, just to notice here, we have manual, automatic, and then we have just a default. So if it doesn't map any of those, we are getting this unknown. If there's time at the end, I'm going to show a way we can actually make this kind of like a one-liner code based on using this lovely syntax here, but I will keep moving for now. So let's take our transmission from JSON. And what's important is we are not executing this function here. We're not calling it. We're just passing a reference to it. So just note there's no parentheses. And same with this. We're going to use transmission from JSON. And if we get the autocomplete, it will put the parentheses and the value. Just hit backspace twice and you'll be good. So let's save that now. And we'll let everything run. Now it looks like we have an issue here. I saw something happened. I think we just mixed something up here. Transmission to JSON. Did I mix up the to JSON? No. All right, it took me a moment to figure out what went wrong. We used transmission from JSON twice. This should, of course, be to JSON. We save, and we should be back in good shape now. And we'll go back to our normal terminal and just run this thing again. And now we shouldn't see that error. And we'll actually see, the type in Dart is transmission.automatic here. And in this case, it is actually transmission.stickShift because that's what we sort of called it here. But of course, when we send it back up to the API, we're going to be using manual and we're going to be using automatic here. So that's, yeah, to JSON from JSON. And this isn't just for enums. You can do this for any kind of field, anything in our from JSON, this would have to be a string or an int or a double or something that your API can send back, and we can convert it to something else, be it another string or something. We can basically do what we want on it and map it to something else, and that's allows us to do it without us having to do too much work at all. Okay, next on the list, we had something called color, and what I'm thinking is. So we could just do required string color, and that works just fine. Let's just look at our thing here. Everything's going to work fine. But I'm imagining in our application that we actually might want to have like a color property on our model that is actually like a material color or something, like something that we can actually render on the screen instead of this hexadecimal thing. So I could name this, instead color hex, but of course by doing that and running this, we will get an error because it can't find color hex. So here's another great case to use our JsonKey to actually use color like it is, but map it to our own name. So not much different than this, but the reason I want to show this is you could now have a getter, which we'll get into that in a minute, that would convert the color hex to an actual color and back again and use like, make it sort of work better with your app. That being said, I'm not going to show that example because this is a Dart project. And if it was a Flutter project, I'd have access to the material color. I don't in Dart, and it will throw some errors. But just wanted to show that example nonetheless. But speaking of getters and whatnot, it's a pretty handy thing to have on your model, and because sometimes you want to just like, it's not something that's going to be like data that is coming back from API, but kind of like a computed version of something based on the data. So for instance, maybe, and this is really good for things like labelings and stuff like that, doing maybe like date formatting on stuff. But let's actually have something called owner label here. And we're doing it as a getter. And basically in this, what we can return is the owner, right? But the owner might be null. So we can actually fall back to something like, not owned. This car is basically not owned. And we're doing this now just in this one spot, and everything's great so that we can use this owner label in our app and not have to, do this same logic 100 times. And then if we wanted to change it, we can do it in one spot. That's just one of many examples. But you will see we have an error when we do this. When we add our own sort of custom getters, setters, factories, that kind of stuff, we have problems. And in order to solve that, we actually have to do this thing right at the top. We just do const car dot underscore parentheses. And once we save this and regenerate, we'll actually see everything is good again. And this kind of just opens up the app, or the model rather, to allow you to have these sort of things. So if you're getting errors when you're creating your own like custom getters, setters, whatever, that's probably why. You just have to open this up here. And then, yeah, now we have an owner label, which is kind of cool. Okay. Let's have a new field. Actually, are we missing anything? We might. No, I think that's all the fields that we were covering in here. So sometimes, though, you want your own field on your model that isn't even part of your API, right? So let's just have something, and maybe it's a bool called user has clicked. We want to track whether the user clicked on this model. And, frankly, this might be something that's better to live within a different part of your application, not necessarily the model. But this is just an example of something you might need to do at some point. So what we can do here is, because this is something we don't want to be getting back from our API, or something that we're going to be sending to our API, let us actually use this new JsonKey that we haven't seen before, and it's called include toJson, and we can set that to false, and include fromJson false. So we don't necessarily have to have both of those, but this will basically mean, okay, when we're converting it to JSON on the server to send it back to the server, we're not going to even include this key. We're not going to make it null. We're not going to make it void. We're just not going to include it at all. And same with the fromJson. We won't be expecting to see it. Now, in this case, because this value needs a default value, I mean, we could choose to just make an optional bool, but I think optional bools are weird. We're getting into like a trinary data type, which does not make sense for this. We'll actually just set our own default here of false so that we don't get an error. So now if we actually run this again and look for that key user has clicked, we're going to still see it in our Dart model here, but we're not going to see it in the toJSON because we've said not to include it. So that's cool. And a handy thing, there's definitely use cases for that for sure. Let's talk about another part of this. We kind of have our model fleshed out. I mentioned at the start of the video something called copyWith, which I'm sure you've used before in some things. So let's go to our main.dart where we're doing this. And after we do this debug stuff, and in fact, I'm just going to comment this out for now. Let's get our, let's make something called test car or something. Or let's actually call it copy car. And what we can do is we can take car. I'm going to do cars.first, and that'll just get us, the first one in that list. And we can run .copyWith, which is just something built in based on, using these generators. And if we actually look at this code here, you eventually will find it by going through all this stuff. But yeah, it's not code that we wrote. It is part of Freeze. And within here, we could do things like maybe change its color, color hex to, let's just use number 0000 FF. RGB, that would be blue in that case. So we're going like that. And if we actually do a debug print now on our copy car, we will see that copy car now has this blue color here, and blue color, in both cases, whether it's our Dart version or our, toJSON. So that's just copyWith. And of course, we can do this with any property. We could use it for that user has clicked value. Maybe that's a good idea. We could update the owner, like say we wanted to purchase the car and give it an owner name. And that brings me to another nice pattern that I like for those kind of things. For like a transactional kind of operation, as an example, purchasing a car, we could of course put the car, we could do something like this and pass the owner, and now the owner is Tyler, for instance. And that's fine. But say we're doing this a lot of times in our app, what I like to do is actually create our own sort of helpers here. And we can have a helper that's going to essentially return a new car. We'll call it purchase. And what it's going to expect is the name. And within here, all we do is we go return copyWith. We don't say car.copyWith because we're actually referencing this. And in fact, we could write this.copyWith, but that's not necessary in Dart. CopyWith. And now right here, we can actually make the owner whatever that name is. So now in our implementation of our code, maybe we'll rename this to purchase car. And we can actually go cars.first and run this purchase function by passing in, Bobby or something. And if we debug print, or even just print this, our purchase car, we will see in here that it is now owned by Bobby, Bobby right here. So just a nice way to do it. And it's a good pattern too, generally, especially if you're doing this with something like any kind of state management block, RiverPod, you never really want to modify the car. Like I could have, of course, just gone, cars.first. Owner name, equals Bobby. I could have done it this way, but you'll actually see there's some errors here because there's no setter. You can add your own setters, but usually it's just not a good pattern. Bobby, let's change it to Bobby. And the reason is especially in like when you're trying to update your UI because of a state change using something like a notifier in RiverPod or an event in Block. If it's the same object and it's just mutated, it's not going to actually notice that that was a change. It needs to be a new thing. And that's why you always see things in RiverPod like state equals state dot copyWith or state this new version of state and so on and so forth. You're never just modifying the state itself. You're returning a new one. So that's why I want to show this, because this actually does return a new one, right? It takes our current one and it's returning a copied version of it using this new parameter. All right. That is all I'm going to show in this video. I did have a few other things planned, but I was trying to keep this pretty short. So I'm going to skip the other ideas I had for some more advanced stuff, because this was really the main stuff I wanted to cover. It's kind of like, here's a bonus tip. That being said, in the comments, if you love this and you're like, I want to learn more, and I like, these examples of these lovely cars, comment that, tell me, and I will make a sort of like follow up with some more advanced features. So thanks so much for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one.